In the grim calculus of the Second World War, few machines embodied the ideological and industrial clash of nations more completely than a tank. For the German High Command, intoxicated by the early victories of the Blitzkrieg, the tank was a surgical instrument, a precision weapon designed for devastating breakthrough and rapid exploitation. Their early panzers, and later the monstrous cats like the Tiger and Panther, were marvels of engineering, forged in the deep-seated German tradition of quality over quantity. When the Allies, and specifically the Americans, finally rolled their own primary battle tank onto the North African stage in 1942, the reaction from the seasoned, victorious German field marshals was not fear, but a cold, dismissive derision. They saw the M4 Sherman, with its distinctive profile and modest gun, as a hurried compromise, an adequate but ultimately inferior combat vehicle. They laughed. This laughter, however, would prove to be one of the most profound and fatal miscalculations of the entire conflict. The very genesis of the Sherman was rooted in the necessity of speed, not perfection. When Germany shattered the Western Front in 1940, conquering France and driving the British back across the Channel, American industrial leaders and military strategists were forced into a brutally quick reassessment of modern warfare. The tank, previously considered a supporting element for infantry, was now the spearhead of the new order. The existing US tanks like the M3 Lee and Grant were stopgap measures, functional but flawed, hampered by multiple guns and antiquated design principles. The United States needed a standardized medium tank capable of meeting the Wehrmacht on equal terms, and they needed it yesterday. The specifications handed to the Ordnance Department in 1941 were almost contradictory. It had to be reliably fast, easily maintained by green crews, structurally sound for mass production, and capable of mounting the new 75 mm gun. Crucially, its size and weight had to be constrained so that it could be easily shipped across 2 oceans, and moved swiftly through Allied supply chains to any corner of the globe. This logistics constraint was an absolute precondition that would forever define the M4's combat performance and its ultimate legacy. The resulting M4 Sherman was a triumph of the factory floor, a vehicle whose true genius lay not in its armor thickness or its gun's penetration, but in its profound industrial scalability. It was designed not to be the best tank on the battlefield, but the most available tank on every battlefield. Its radial engine was borrowed from the aircraft industry, a ready-made power plant that could be mass-produced quickly. Its hull was designed for welding or casting, allowing manufacturers to choose the fastest method available, depending on their plant's capability. The initial 75 main gun was proven and reliable, simple for novice gunners to operate. This focus on simplification and standardization was a deeply American approach, reflecting a national mindset that prioritized overwhelming output. While German factories were laboriously crafting high-precision components for the Panther, the American auto industry was tooling up to stamp out Sherman parts like automotive fenders. The German response, particularly in the lead-up to the North African campaign, was characterized by a dangerous hubris. Their experiences in Poland and France had taught them that their engineering superiority was a guarantee of victory. They viewed the American emphasis on ease of production as an admission of technological mediocrity. They saw the Sherman's tall profile, a necessary evil to accommodate the radial engine and the turret basket for quick crew access, as an unmissable target. They noted its relatively thin, vertically sloped armor, which offered less protection than the increasingly sloped armor of their own designs. The initial combat reports arriving in Berlin, detailing engagements where German tanks had successfully outmaneuvered and defeated early M4s, only cemented this belief. The enemy, they concluded, was substituting brute numbers for genuine tactical and technical superiority. But in the long war of attrition that the conflict was rapidly becoming, brute numbers, backed by an inexhaustible industrial base, were not a substitution for superiority, they were the superiority. The stage was set for a collision between 2 fundamentally different philosophies of warfare: the German doctrine of the few, perfect instruments versus the Allied doctrine of the overwhelming, adaptable mass. It was a contest between the craftsman and the production line, and history would soon prove which vision held the decisive key to victory. The contemptuous laughter of the German tank commanders was in part justified by the Sherman's raw specifications, when viewed through the narrow, high-quality lens of German engineering. The Panzer was built to maximize combat efficacy in a one-on-one duel. The Sherman was built to maximize deployment speed and logistical reliability on a global scale. This fundamental divergence led to clear, recognizable trade-offs. The Sherman's height, which made it easier for the four-man crew and commander to spot targets, also made it an enormous target for German anti-tank guns and tanks alike. Its standard 75 main gun, perfectly adequate against the older Panzer III and early Panzer IV models, struggled desperately to penetrate the frontal armor of the formidable new German heavy hitters, the Tiger I and the Panther. Against the thick, well-angled A-team glacis plate of the Panther, or the solid 100 frontal armor of the Tiger, the standard 75 round was often little more than an annoying distraction. Early Allied tankers learned the grim lesson that to defeat these heavy tanks, they often had to rely on improbable flank shots or outright luck. The German focus on quality had culminated in these engineering marvels. The Tiger I, introduced in late 1942, was a technical and psychological nightmare for the Allies. Weighing in at 57 tons, it mounted the terrifying 88 kW K-36 cannon, a gun that could slice through the Sherman's armor at ranges where the Sherman could not even hope to reply. The Panther, though initially suffering from crippling mechanical issues, represented a more balanced design, marrying heavy sloped armor with the high-velocity 75 kW K-42 gun, which was far superior to the Sherman's original armament. These tanks were bespoke machines, complicated to build, demanding in maintenance, and requiring specialized, high-octane fuel and expert crews. Their production numbers remained frustratingly low for the German war machine, but their combat efficiency was undeniable, creating a chilling battlefield imbalance. In contrast, the M4 Sherman was an exercise in pragmatism. Its sloped armor was decent, offering better protection than its profile suggested, especially when later enhanced with appliqué armor plates. Its primary strength, however, lay in its mechanical reliability. The Sherman's easy-to-access engine, robust transmission, and stable suspension system meant that for every one German heavy tank breaking down on the march or requiring days of maintenance, 2 or 3 Shermans were ready and waiting for their next engagement. This reliability was paramount in the long, difficult lines of supply that stretched from American factories to North Africa, Italy, and eventually Normandy. The crew could often repair battle damage or perform routine maintenance in hours, not days. This logistical robustness was a tactical asset that rarely appeared in paper specifications, but which deeply impacted operational tempo. Another defining and often overlooked aspect of the Sherman was the rate of fire of its main gun. The 75 gun, while lacking the penetrating power of the German 88, was highly effective against infantry, field positions, and light vehicles, firing a powerful high-explosive HE round. The gun and its turret were electrically powered, allowing for incredibly fast traverse, a critical advantage in the rapid-fire chaos of close combat against anti-tank teams or counterattacking infantry. German commanders, fixed on the ideal of the tank versus tank duel, often failed to appreciate the Sherman's versatility as an infantry support vehicle, a role it excelled at, delivering devastating HE fire exactly where and when the infantry needed it most. This adaptation to the comprehensive battlefield, rather than the singular tank engagement, marked a turning point in the war's mechanized warfare doctrine. The trade-offs inherent in the Sherman's design, the vulnerability, the undergunned profile, became the daily reality for the American and British tank crews who manned them. They knew the risks. They knew the danger of meeting a Tiger head-on. They adopted grim nicknames for their mounts, such as the Ronson or the Tommy Cooker, due to the terrifying tendency of the gasoline engine and stowed ammunition to ignite when the armor was pierced. This was the dark side of the production line imperative. But it was a trade-off that the American industrial machine was determined to mitigate, not by building a better one-off tank, but by building 10 tanks for every one German behemoth, and by continuously seeking field-driven improvements. This focus on getting something good enough to the front line, and then making it better through iterative design and modification, was an industrial and strategic philosophy that was utterly alien to the German mindset, and one that was about to turn their initial amusement into profound despair. The moment the German laughter began to catch in their throats arrived not with a single decisive battle, but with the mounting tally of the campaigns in North Africa and Italy. The initial encounters were indeed brutal reality checks for the young American armored units. At the Kasserine Pass in Tunisia in February 1943, American forces suffered a shattering defeat, in part due to the sheer combat disparity between the early M4 Shermans and the German heavy and medium tanks. Field reports from this period paint a clear picture of the terrifying effectiveness of the Tiger I Sherman rounds bounced harmlessly off its frontal armor, while the 88mm gun punched straight through the Sherman's plates with contemptuous ease, often resulting in catastrophic internal explosions. The psychological impact of facing a tank that could not be killed, a ghost in the sand that delivered deadly, precise fire from beyond the Sherman's effective range, was immense. The German field commanders, led by the legendary Erwin Rommel, felt their belief in technological superiority affirmed. They saw Kasserine as proof that American production would not translate into battlefield dominance. But the Germans were looking at the wrong set of numbers. They were focused on the exchange ratio in individual tank duels which favored their Panthers and Tigers. They were ignoring the second, more important set of numbers, the replacement rate. When a German Tiger was knocked out, replacing it could take months. The complex supply chains needed to deliver a 57-ton vehicle with its specialized components and bespoke engineering across the Mediterranean were fragile and often targeted. For the Americans, the industrial pipeline was relentlessly, brutally efficient. A knocked-out Sherman was often replaced on the line within days. More M4s were being driven off the transatlantic transports than the Germans could ever hope to manufacture in the same period. This industrial steamroller was the invisible weapon, the supply chain its ammunition. Getty Images. As the war in North Africa progressed, ending with the total collapse of the Axis forces in May 1943, the sheer, crushing weight of Allied material began to redefine the conflict. The Germans had won the duel, but they had lost the battle and the campaign due to a complete failure to sustain their forces. The lessons learned by the Allied tank crews were hard-won and immediately implemented. The engineers did not have time to invent a new tank, but they could adapt the existing one. American tankers quickly adopted the practice of borrowing the longer-barreled 76mm gun from the tank destroyer concept and fitting it to the Sherman, giving it the necessary muzzle velocity to threaten the Panther, though the Tiger remained a difficult kill. The British, recognizing the same deficiency, developed the stopgap but hugely effective Sherman Firefly, mounting their potent 17-pounder anti-tank gun in the Sherman turret. This modification provided the Allies with a gun that could finally meet the German heavy armor on equal terms, a necessary answer to the challenge the German engineers had laid down. The war in Italy, often called the soft underbelly, offered a relentless series of close-quarters mountain engagements that again tested the Sherman's resilience. The tight terrain often negated the long-range advantage of the German guns. Here, the Sherman's quick turret traverse, its low ground pressure allowing it to maneuver in difficult soil, and the devastating impact of its HE round against infantry positions proved invaluable. Yet the presence of German heavy armor remained a constant, terrifying threat. It forced the development of new tactics, shifting the burden of victory away from the single-tank duel and onto the concept of combined arms. The Allied command realized that the Sherman's power was not in its individual performance, but in its ability to operate within a synchronized system. A single Sherman might be outmatched, but a platoon of 4 Shermans, supported by infantry and artillery, and often accompanied by a dedicated tank destroyer unit, whose sole purpose was to lure and eliminate enemy tanks, was a force the German heavy armor could not ignore. The German belief in the decisive power of the isolated, perfect weapon was coming face to face with the reality of American military doctrine, the efficient use of an overwhelming system. The arrogant laughter was fading, replaced by the grim calculation of how many perfect tanks would be lost to the ceaseless swarm of the inferior American machines. The true destructive capacity of the Sherman lay not in its armor or armament, but in the sheer, unimaginable industrial engine that created it. The outnumbered portion of the equation began not in the sands of Tunisia or the hills of Italy, but in the humming, 24-hour factories of Detroit, Cleveland, and Philadelphia. This was the genius of American economic mobilization, a phenomenon utterly beyond the comprehension of the German war economy. which had never fully converted to total war and remained hampered by bureaucratic infighting and a focus on small-batch precision production. By the time of the Normandy landings in 1944, the contrast was stark and unbridgeable. The United States produced nearly 50,000 M4 Sherman tanks during the war, making it the most produced tank in American history. When combined with the production of other combat and support vehicles, the numbers become truly staggering. In contrast, Germany managed to produce only about 1,350 Tiger IS and fewer than 6,000 Panthers. This vast disparity meant that for every one German heavy tank, the Allies could field dozens of Shermans and supporting armor. The difference was a factor of scale, a dimension of conflict that the German planners, focused on the quality of the individual unit, had catastrophically ignored. The American manufacturing apparatus was uniquely suited to this challenge. The auto industry, already mastered in the art of assembly line production and interchangeable parts, transitioned seamlessly into producing tanks, planes, and trucks. Manufacturers like Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors did not just build the tanks, they built the entire supporting ecosystem. This industrial dominance translated directly into battlefield resilience. When a German tank was knocked out, the crew often had to salvage parts from other wrecks to attempt a repair, and replacement was rare. When a Sherman was lost, a replacement was usually just days away, a fresh tank rolling off the endless conveyor belt of the US supply chain. This relentless ability to replace losses was the ultimate psychological and tactical weapon. The German crews, even after scoring multiple kills, knew the enemy's numbers were inexhaustible. This logistical might was personified by the legendary Red Ball Express, the massive, improvised network of thousands of trucks and drivers that became the lifeline of the Allied advance after the breakout from Normandy. This supply chain delivered the fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and critically, the replacement tanks that ensured the Allied momentum never stalled. The Sherman's reliability was essential here. The trucks were moving quickly and supplies were limited, so every tank that broke down due to mechanical failure was a drain on the system. The Sherman's design, built for easy maintenance and reliable long-distance travel, was key to keeping the Red Ball Express running and the front moving. Meanwhile, the German war economy was constantly straining under the weight of Allied bombing and internal inefficiencies. The Tiger and the Panther required vast amounts of scarce materials and specialized labor. Their engines, transmissions, and heavy suspensions were prone to failure under the stress of combat and long marches, often immobilizing the tanks and forcing crews to scuttle them rather than leave them intact for the advancing Allies. This self-inflicted damage, driven by over-engineering and logistical fragility, reduced the effective numbers of German armor far below the already low production figures. The reality was that a significant percentage of German heavy armor was often unavailable for battle, waiting for parts that might never arrive. The German generals had indeed laughed at the Sherman, but their laughter was the sound of men obsessed with the perfect sword while ignoring the flood of the entire enemy arsenal. The Sherman, the dependable, adaptable, and mass-produced instrument, was the physical manifestation of an industrial and economic power that Germany could never hope to rival. The Allies were not just fighting a war, they were waging an industrial war of attrition, and in that contest, the Sherman tank was the definitive winning currency. The stage was now set for the ultimate test of this production dominance, the brutal close-quarters combat of France. The true test of the Sherman, and the crucible in which American armored tactics were forged, began with the bitter, relentless fighting in the Norman Bocage. This was a dense, ancient landscape of thick hedgerows, sunken lanes, and small fields, the absolute antithesis of the open, tank-friendly plains of Eastern Europe or North Africa. It was a terrain that negated the Sherman's speed and maneuverability, and perfectly concealed the devastating anti-tank weapons and heavy German armor. The close confines of the Bocage meant that the Germans could ambush American tanks from ranges of 50 yards or less, nullifying the superiority of the Panther's long-range gun and turning the Sherman's tall profile into a liability. The grim reality for Allied tank crews was that in the hedgerow country, the Sherman was fighting on the Germans' terms. Tank losses were high, shockingly so. The German 88 anti-tank guns and the high-velocity guns of the Panthers were exacting a heavy toll. Yet this intense pressure did not break the American advance. Instead, it forced a rapid, critical adaptation of both equipment and doctrine. Necessity, born of overwhelming danger, birthed a simple but revolutionary innovation, the Rhino tank. Born from the ingenuity of a sergeant, this modification involved welding steel prongs, salvaged from German hedge-cutting machines, onto the front of the Sherman's hull. These tusks allowed the tank to literally rip through the thick, earthen base of the hedgerows, creating a safe exit point rather than forcing the tank to expose its vulnerable belly while climbing over the top. The Rhino became an unofficial, but absolutely essential, part of the Sherman's battlefield kit, drastically increasing the speed of the advance and saving countless lives. But the most profound change was tactical. The doctrine shifted from seeking the clean, singular tank duel to embracing the power of combined arms. American tankers learned to never operate without close, integrated support. A Sherman platoon was now expected to move in concert with infantry, the infantry protecting the tank from close-range anti-tank teams, the dreaded Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck, and the Sherman using its versatile 75 mH rounds to suppress or eliminate German infantry hiding in the hedgerows. The focus was on saturation, not precision. The objective was not to outshoot a Panther, but to outflank, outmaneuver, and overwhelm the position supporting the Panther. The Sherman crews also mastered the art of flank and spank, knowing their frontal armor was inadequate, and their main gun often ineffective against the enemy's front. They used the Sherman's superior speed and mechanical reliability to maneuver rapidly. The goal was to reach the softer side or rear armor of the German heavy tanks, often supported by artillery fire to suppress the German crew's observation. The tank destroyer battalions, originally intended to fight as highly mobile independent units, were integrated more closely into the armored divisions, essentially functioning as mobile 90mm artillery, providing the necessary anti-tank muscle the early Shermans lacked. This organizational flexibility and willingness to immediately adapt to battlefield conditions was a significant advantage over the more rigid, doctrine-bound German command structure. The German High Command, still clinging to the ideal of the perfect, overwhelming weapon, struggled to reconcile its theory with the reality unfolding in France. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, commanding in the west, saw his handful of potent panzer divisions slowly being whittled away by an enemy that kept coming, an enemy that replaced losses instantaneously, and an enemy that learned faster than the German supply chain could replace its damaged tanks. The German laughter was now a bitter acknowledgement of their own industrial limitation. The individual German tank crew might win its duel, but the system of which that crew was a part was slowly, inexorably losing the war. As the campaign transitioned from the crushing stalemate of the Bocage to the desperate, fluid breakout of Operation Cobra in late July 1944, the true nature of the Sherman as an industrial weapon became unassailable. The Allied strategy was simple: leverage the enormous, untapped potential of American air and industrial power to create a localized, overwhelming punch. Operation Cobra began with a carpet-bombing operation of unprecedented scale, turning the German defensive lines to rubble and paralyzing their command structure. When the Sherman and the accompanying armored columns finally surged forward, they were moving through a battlefield designed by American logistics and air supremacy. In the open fields and rapidly advancing lines of communication that followed the breakout, the Sherman's strength shone. Its speed, its mechanical reliability, and its ease of maintenance allowed the American spearheads to cover ground at speeds the Germans simply could not match. German tanks, particularly the Panthers, were constantly breaking down on the march. Engine failures, transmission woes, and fuel consumption issues crippled their ability to form a cohesive defense. The Sherman's robust design ensured that while Allied losses remained high, the tempo of the advance was maintained, creating a persistent crisis for the Wehrmacht. This period also saw the final critical push for better armament: the arrival of the M4A3E8 EZ8, a Sherman variant equipped with the superior 76mm high-velocity gun, a vastly improved horizontal volute spring suspension, HVSS, for better cross-country performance, and wet ammunition stowage to dramatically reduce the risk of catastrophic fires, marked a turning point in the Sherman's combat efficacy. Though it was still not the equal of the Panther in frontal armor, it could now effectively engage the enemy at increasing ranges, leveling the technological playing field that had been so lopsided at Kasserine Pass. The British, with their Sherman Firefly mounting the devastating 17-pounder, delivered the crucial, knockout punch needed in any high-stakes tank engagement. Crucially, as American production ramped up, these improved variants did not just replace old tanks. They were poured into the existing pipeline alongside them, ensuring that the sheer numerical advantage was maintained while quality steadily improved. The German response was desperate and reactive. They attempted to concentrate their best armored divisions in limited counterattacks, but these actions were perpetually hampered by a chronic lack of fuel, inadequate repair facilities, and the constant harassment of Allied fighter bombers, the infamous Jarbos. The German High Command, having bet the house on the perfection of their heavy tanks, found that the complexity of these weapons was now their gravest liability. They were perfect instruments, trapped in a collapsing logistical framework. The Battle of the Bulge in the winter of 1944–45 provided the ultimate non-technical demonstration of the Sherman's true power. In the Ardennes, Hitler gambled his last reserves on a massive counter-offensive, hoping to seize Allied supply depots and force a political truce. For the American tankers, it was a brutal, freezing fight against superior German armor, Panthers and King Tigers, in the fog-choked forests. Again, the Sherman suffered disproportionately in head-to-head duels, but the critical difference was the resilience of the supply chain. While German counterattacks stalled within weeks due to an immediate and irreversible shortage of fuel, ammunition, and replacement parts, the American forces displayed an astonishing capacity to absorb catastrophic losses and immediately bring fresh tanks, crews, and supplies to the front. The M4, reliable even in the bitter cold, continued to run. The Red Ball Express, now operating in snow and ice, kept delivering. The Battle of the Bulge did not prove the Sherman was a better tank than the King Tiger, but it definitively proved the American industrial system was a more powerful weapon than the entire German military-industrial complex. The laughter had completely died out, replaced by a hollow-eyed realization that they were not fighting an army, but a logistical tsunami. The final, grinding advance into the German homeland in 1945 was the long, inevitable conclusion of the industrial war. The terrain shifted again, moving from the forested valleys to the open plains and finally into the bombed-out cities. In this landscape, the Sherman continued to perform its indispensable role as the workhorse of the mechanized army. The sheer, overwhelming presence of the M4 was everywhere, crossing the Rhine, clearing roadblocks, and grinding down the last vestiges of the Wehrmacht. By this stage of the war, the German tank divisions were shadows of their former selves. The highly trained, veteran crews that had once laughed at the Sherman were largely gone, replaced by poorly trained, desperate conscripts. Their vehicles were a mix of Panthers, late-model Panzers, and static Sturmgeschütz assault guns, often fighting without adequate fuel or spare parts. The Tigers and Panthers, still formidable when encountered, were no longer the main threat. Their sporadic appearances served only to delay the inevitable, often being abandoned due to mechanical failure or lack of fuel long before they were destroyed in battle. The Sherman, meanwhile, had reached its technological apex in the war with the widespread deployment of the Easy-8 variant and the continued heavy use of the British Firefly. These tanks, now armed with guns capable of effective long-range engagement, ensured that the Sherman was no longer simply a target to be sacrificed. But more importantly, the tactical doctrine had solidified. Every Sherman was part of a finely tuned system. It moved under the protection of artillery, air support, and integrated infantry. To kill one Sherman, a German crew often exposed itself to the fire of 5 more, plus the devastating barrage of mortars and machine guns. This was the true meaning of the tank being outnumbered and destroyed. It was a systemic victory, not a head-to-head one. The economic and industrial context provides the ultimate explanation for the failure of the German armored philosophy. The Wehrmacht's obsession with the bespoke, over-engineered weapon, the Tiger, had led to an unsustainable drain on resources and manpower. They had traded flexibility and volume for an illusory perfection. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, repeatedly noted the inefficiency of the German production system, which prioritized the creation of these specialized, complicated beasts while failing to produce enough trucks, fuel, or spare parts to keep them running. Their finest tanks were often found abandoned on the side of a road, out of gas. a silent testament to the folly of fighting a total war with a craftsman's precision. The irony, of course, was that the Shermans that were destroying the last of the German defenses were often being fueled by German gasoline captured from abandoned depots and repaired with parts shipped with ruthless efficiency from the American industrial heartland. The very logistics that the German generals had dismissed as unsophisticated were now the chains tightening around their necks. The M4 Sherman, initially a compromise, became the unyielding instrument of economic and industrial destruction. The final tally of the war reveals the chilling, factual reality behind the initial German arrogance. The average life expectancy of a German heavy tank in the latter stages of the war was measured in weeks, often ending not from enemy fire but from mechanical failure or abandonment. The constant pressure of the Allied numerical superiority meant that German crews, even those with Tigers and Panthers, were never allowed to disengage, resupply, or repair in peace. The relentless churn of the Sherman pipeline gave the Allies the strategic initiative everywhere, all the time. The legacy of the M4 Sherman is complex, a narrative of sacrifice and success, technical deficiency and overwhelming effectiveness. The young men who crewed them often paid the price for the design compromises, suffering high casualty rates, a grim testament to the speed required of America's entry into the tank war. But the Sherman's ultimate historical vindication lies not in its comparison to the Tiger, but in its profound impact on the outcome of the war. It was the delivery platform for American industrial might. It was reliable, trainable, and most importantly, available in numbers that crushed the will and capability of the enemy. The tank was not just a weapon, it was an industrial promise kept, an ironclad guarantee that for every loss, 2 more would arrive to take its place. In the post-war analysis, the most successful tank of the war was defined not by its armor-piercing capability, but by its strategic mobility and industrial sustainment. The Soviet T-34, the other great success story, shared this core philosophy: speed, simplicity, and mass production. The M4 Sherman took this ethos and magnified it with the unmatched power of the American economy. Its true genius lay in its ability to be shipped anywhere, fought by anyone, and kept running under impossible circumstances. The German design philosophy, which created some of the most feared tanks in history, was ultimately a dead end, an unsustainable path of over-engineering that guaranteed tactical perfection at the cost of operational viability. The final irony is complete. The German generals, with their meticulous focus on the perfect weapon, could not see the forest for the trees. They focused on the deficiencies of the Sherman's armor and gun, blind to the colossal, overwhelming force of the American production lines that were stamping them out. The laughter of 1942 faded into the silent, smoking ruins of 1945. The Sherman, the inferior compromise, did not win the war through technical finesse. It won the war by being the unstoppable embodiment of the American capacity to outproduce, outsupply, and ultimately outlast a technically superior but fundamentally fragile opponent. The tanks they had laughed at were the ones that ultimately outnumbered them, surrounded them, and destroyed them. This, in the end, is the powerful, unromantic, and utterly definitive history of the M4 Sherman.